Cowboy paid just 25 cents for a fierce puppy. 3 months later. It shocked everyone. The fire cast long shadows in Caleb Blackwood's cabin, a lonely outpost against the vast, silent prairie. In the corner, a pair of wild yellow eyes watched his every move. A low growl rumbled from the scrap of fur he'd named Lobo. Caleb didn't flinch. He just sipped his coffee, the silence of a familiar friend. He understood that growl. It was the same sound his own grieving heart made whenever the world tried to get too close. He'd paid a drunk 2 bits for that sound in town, 25 cents for a creature as unwanted and broken as he felt. He saw fear, not fury, in those watchful eyes and offered a piece of jerky. A truce. He thought he was merely saving a lost dog, a simple act of pity for another soul left behind. He couldn't know that this fierce tiny companion held a wild secret, one that would soon leave him breathless with shock and force him to protect it from the very world he'd tried to forget. The pup didn't move. It remained coiled in the corner, a tense spring of muscle and mistrust. But the growl subsided, replaced by a desperate, hungry whine that cut through Caleb's fortress of solitude. He tossed the jerky. It landed softly in the dust a few feet from the creature. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then, quick as a snake, a small dark head darted out, snatched the meat, and retreated into the shadows. Progress. The first few days bled into one another in a rhythm of quiet observation. Lobo kept his distance, a shadow flitting at the edges of Caleb's life, but he never strayed. He watched Caleb chop wood, his small body tensed at the sharp crack of the axe. He watched Caleb mend a bridle, his yellow eyes tracking the slow, methodical movement of the needle. It was a fragile peace, brokered in the quiet language of shared wounds, a silent acknowledgement that both of them were survivors of a wreck the world could not see. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer empty. It was occupied by a fierce, breathing secret. But secrets like men could not live on air alone. The flour sack was nearly empty, and the coffee was down to its last bitter grounds. Town was a necessity he loathed. Well, Lobo Caleb murmured the name, still feeling strange on his tongue. Looks like you're going to see the world. He couldn't leave the pup. It was too small, and the prairie was full of hawks and coyotes. With a sigh, he lined an old leather saddlebag with a scrap of blanket, and after a brief, snarling protest, managed to tuck the small, warm body inside. The town of Redemption greeted him with its usual cacophony of false hope. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of men, the distant tinny tune from the saloon. It was all a noise designed to drown out the vast, unforgiving silence that surrounded them. Caleb tied his horse in front of the mercantile, the weight in his saddlebag shifting nervously. The air inside smelled of cured leather-ground coffee and the sharp, clean scent of lye soap. A woman with kind, weary eyes looked up from behind the counter. "Haven't seen you in a while, Caleb," she said. Her name was Elara. She ran the store with a quiet efficiency that seemed to hold the town together. Figured the hills had swallowed you whole. "Still here," Caleb replied, his voice a low gravel. He moved toward the barrels of flour and beans, his movements economical, wanting this interaction to be over. "Just need the usual." As Elara weighed out the flour, a low, guttural growl vibrated from the saddlebag at his hip. Elara froze, her eyes wide. "Caleb, what in heaven's name was that?" Before he could answer, the bell above the door jingled violently. The large, imposing frame of Bartholomew Corbin filled the doorway, his face a thundercloud. He was the man who owned most of the valley, and he wore his power like a heavy coat. "Elara!" he boomed, not bothering to acknowledge Caleb. Another calf gone. "Damn wolves are getting bolder. A man can't make a living with predators breathing down his neck." Caleb felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He instinctively shifted, placing his body between Corbin and the saddlebag, from which another barely audible growl escaped. Corbin didn't seem to notice his rage filling the small store. "Something's got to be done," Corbin declared, slamming a gloved fist on the counter. "And I'm the man to do it." Caleb paid for his supplies, his hands moving with forced calm. He gave Alara a curt nod, his eyes telling her to stay silent. He could feel Corbin's heavy stare on his back as he walked out the door, a stare that felt like a brand. Out in the harsh sunlight, he untied his horse, every nerve on edge. The world had just become a much more dangerous place. He looked down at the saddlebag. He was no longer just a man adrift in his own grief. He was a man with something to protect. And for the first time in years, that felt terrifyingly like something to live for. The ride back from redemption was a silent pilgrimage of dread. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered accusation. The weight in Caleb's saddlebag was no longer just a pup. It was a fragile secret, a 25-cent fuse lit by Corbin's rage. Back in the sanctuary of the cabin, he gently lifted Lobo out. The pup, smelling the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke, shook himself and looked up at Caleb, not with a growl, but with a questioning tilt of his head. The shared danger in town had been a forge, and in its heat, a new harder bond was being hammered into shape. Caleb felt a ghost of a feeling he'd buried long ago right next to his wife and daughter. Protectiveness. It was an ache he welcomed. Weeks turned to months, measured in the lengthening of a shadow at his heels. The prairie seasons shifted the summer sun, bleaching the tall grasses to the color of bone, the first autumn winds whispering down from the high peaks with a promise of cold to come. Lobo grew with an unnatural speed. At first he was a gangly apprentice, all paws and ears, learning the hunt at Caleb's side. He would watch impossibly still as Caleb set a snare, and would later appear with a rabbit held gently in his jaws, his offering laid at the cabin door. They moved through the wilderness like two parts of the same thought. A silent language passed between them, a glance, a low whistle, the subtle shift of a shoulder. There was no need for commands. There was only an unnerving, profound understanding. The pup's playful yip deepened into something ancient. One night, under a full moon that hung like a silver coin in the black sky, Lobo lifted his head and howled. It was not the baying of a hound. It was a long, mournful, and chillingly wild cry that echoed across the valley, a sound that spoke of mountains and loneliness and blood. Caleb stood in the cabin doorway, the sound raising the hairs on his arms. He told himself it was just a strange bark, a quirk of a stray's breeding. He was a good liar when the truth was something he could not afford to believe. By the third month, the lie was wearing thin. Lobo was no longer a pup. He was a sleek, powerful animal, taller and leaner than any dog Caleb had ever seen. His coat was a shifting gray, the color of a gathering storm cloud. His eyes held the fierce yellow intelligence of a creature that knew the world was a thing to be survived. The town of Redemption was a distant memory. Their life was the cabin, the hunt, the vast and silent prairie, until the world came knocking again. They were checking a line of snares near the creek that marked the edge of Caleb's land when the smell hit them. The coppery, sick, sweet scent of death. Lying just on their side of the water was the mangled carcass of a calf. Its flank bore Corbin's unmistakable brand. It was a message. Before Caleb could even process the violation, the sound of hoofbeats thundered toward them. Corbin, flanked by a grim-faced ranch hand, reined his horse to a halt on the opposite bank. His eyes were chips of ice. "Blackwood," he spat, his voice carrying across the creek. "Looks like your pet has been busy. That's my property it was feasting on." Lobo, who had been standing beside Caleb, stiffened. A growl, deeper and more menacing than any puppy sound, rumbled in his chest. He did not bark or lunge. He simply stood his ground, a formidable, silent warning. Caleb's hand rested near the worn handle of his hunting knife. "These aren't wolf tracks, Corbin," he said, his voice dangerously calm. He pointed with his chin to the torn earth around the carcass. "Too small. scattered. This was coyotes. You know it as well as I do. I know what I see. Corbin sneered, his gaze fixed on Lobo. I see a beast, and I see a man foolish enough to harbor it. I warned you something had to be done. You left this here. Caleb stated the realization hitting him with cold certainty. This is a threat. Corbin offered a cruel smile. It's a promise. This ain't over, Blackwood. The next time I lose an animal, I'm not coming for a chat. I'll come with a posse and a rope. We'll burn that beast out of its den, and you with it if you're stupid enough to stand in the way. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving his threat hanging in the air like poison. Caleb stood motionless, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of blood and rust. He looked down at Lobo, at the powerful muscles under that wild gray coat, at the fierce, unwavering loyalty in those yellow eyes. The truth was no longer a whisper. It was a howl, and it was about to bring a war to his door. Corbin's threat settled over the cabin like a winter frost, killing the fragile warmth that had begun to grow there. The ride back was a blur of grim silence. When they reached the clearing, Caleb dismounted and for the first time truly looked at the animal beside him. Not as a pet, not as a companion, but as the world saw him. In the dying light he saw the truth he had so desperately ignored. The long, powerful legs built for the chase. The deep chest made for a howl that could command a valley. The sharp, intelligent eyes that held no trace of domestication, only a fierce and ancient wildness. Lobo was a wolf, a creature of the mountains and the moon, living on borrowed time in a world of men, fences, and fear. A profound and hollow ache spread through Caleb's chest. He thought of the 25 cents. The price of a life deemed worthless by one man, and now a life that would be hunted by many. His first instinct was a familiar one. Run. The word was a serpent whispering of escape. He could pack what little he owned, take Lobo, and disappear so deep into the mountains they would become ghosts. It's what he had done when grief had first claimed him, running from the memories that haunted the settled lands. But as he looked at Lobo, who stood loyally at his side, sensing the turmoil in his master, Caleb felt a different instinct rise. A hard, cold resolve that pushed the fear away. He would not run. Not this time. To run would be to admit guilt. To run would be to abandon the first thing that had made him feel whole in years. He had a decision to make, but he needed to know the lay of the land. He needed to know the enemy. The next morning he rose before the sun. He led Lobo to a small hidden den in the rock formations behind the cabin, a place safe from prying eyes. Lobo whined a deep, anxious sound, pressing his head against Caleb's leg. "I'll be back," Caleb promised, his voice rough. "Just hold the fort." The words felt heavy, a fragile promise in a world built on breaking them. The town of Redemption felt different this time. Before it had been a place of noise and ghosts to be endured. Now it was a hostile camp. He saw men talking in hushed groups, their eyes flicking toward the hills, toward his home. He saw fear, but worse, he saw a grim excitement. A hunt was brewing. He went straight to the mercantile. Elara was sweeping the wooden porch, but she stopped when she saw the look on his face. "It's bad, isn't it?" she asked, her voice low. "He's going to do it," Elara, Caleb said, skipping the pleasantries. "Corbin's going to bring a posse." Elara's face was etched with worry. She ushered him inside, away from the street. "He's already been talking, spreading poison, telling folks there's a rabid beast up in the pines kept by the man who lost his mind to sorrow." She looked at him with genuine pity. "He's using your past against you, Caleb. What I've lost is my own business." Caleb set his jaw tight. "Lobo, my dog. He's not the one killing those calves." "Then you'd best prove it fast," Elara warned, leaning closer. "And it's not just Corbin you need to worry about. He's hired a man, a tracker. Name of Silas Kane." Silas Kane. The name sounded like a rattlesnake's warning. They say he can track a ghost across Bear Rock, Alara whispered. He was an army scout once, but they kicked him out for being too cruel. Hates wolves more than anything. He's the one stoking the fire, telling Corbin it's a whole pack with your Lobo as the alpha. He wants the bounty Corbin's offered. He wants the kill. Caleb felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This was no longer a mob of scared ranchers. This was a professional hunt, led by a man who knew the wilderness as well as he did. A man who would not be fooled by coyote tracks. He bought a small sack of grain and some salt, the transaction a thin veneer of normalcy over the current of war running beneath it. He thanked Alara with a nod and left the weight of this new knowledge heavy on his shoulders. A direct fight was suicide. Hiding was now impossible. There was only one path left. He rode out of town, not toward his cabin, but swinging north toward the low hills bordering Corbin's ranch. He had to stop reacting. He had to start hunting. He had to find the real killers and drag the proof back to the feet of the town before Silas Kane brought the fire and the guns to his door. As the sun began to set, casting the world in long distorted shadows, he finally returned home. A sleek, powerful shape emerged from the pines to meet him. Lobo. Caleb swung down from his horse and knelt, looking the great wolf directly in the eyes. The time for lies, even to himself, was over. "Looks like it's you and me, boy," he whispered, his hand resting on the thick wild fur. "They're coming for us." Lobo whined softly, leaning into the touch, his yellow eyes holding Caleb's gaze with absolute trust. "So we're going hunting first." Dawn broke a blade of pale light on the horizon, cutting through the darkness. There was no coffee, no quiet moment of reflection. There was only the cold, hard weight of the rifle in Caleb's hands and the silent, powerful presence of Lobo at his side. They moved out as the first birds began to sing their mission, a grim counterpoint to the waking world. They were no longer man and companion. They were predators. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. Every sense Caleb possessed was screamingly alive. He saw the subtle press of a hoof in the dirt, the glint of frost on a spider's web, the way the wind moved through the tall grass. Beside him, Lobo moved with a liquid grace, a creature born of this wilderness. His head was low, his nose twitching, reading a story in the air that Caleb could only guess at. They were a single, focused entity, a hunter with 2 bodies, 4 eyes, and the combined instincts of man and wolf. They found the trail by the creek where Corbin had left the carcass. It was a messy tapestry of tracks, but Caleb's practiced eye picked out the story. A small pack of coyotes, 4, maybe 5 of them, desperate and bold. The tracks led them north away from the flatlands and into the jagged teeth of the Badlands, a labyrinth of rock and shadow. For hours they tracked the sun climbing higher, burning the frost from the ground. It was a slow, painstaking process, a conversation with the earth. Here, a tuft of fur caught on a thorny bush. There, the scat of a predator confirming their path. Lobo was relentless, his focus absolute, a living compass needle pointing the way toward the truth. They were deep in a narrow canyon, the walls rising up on either side like ancient, silent judges when Lobo froze. It was not the cautious pause of a tracker. It was a dead stop. The fur on his neck bristled. A low, almost inaudible growl vibrated in his chest, directed not forward, but up, toward the rim of the canyon. Caleb's blood ran cold. He followed Lobo's gaze, and saw him. A silhouette against the brilliant, aching blue of the sky. A man with a rifle as still and patient as the rock he stood upon. Silas Kane. He wasn't with a posse. He was alone. A hunter, not a lawman. There was no shout, no warning, only the sharp, terrifying crack of a high-powered rifle echoing through the canyon. The shot wasn't meant to scare. It was meant to kill. A spray of rock fragments stung Caleb's cheek as the bullet slammed into the canyon wall inches from his head. He threw himself behind a cluster of boulders, pulling Lobo down with him. "Get down!" He hissed the words useless against the sudden reality of the attack. Another shot rang out, ricocheting through their scant cover with a vicious whine. Cain had them pinned. He had the high ground, the better weapon, the killing intent. This was not a hunt for a stray wolf. This was an execution. Alara's warning was a scream in his mind. He wants the kill. Cain was not waiting for Corbin's permission. He was ending this now, where there were no witnesses. Caleb knew they couldn't stay. To fight back was to die. He looked at Lobo, whose yellow eyes were fixed on the ridge, his body coiled with a defiant fury. Caleb grabbed a handful of pebbles and threw them hard against the far canyon wall. The clatter drew a shot from above. It was the only chance they would get. "Go, Lobo, run," he commanded, his voice a harsh whisper. Lobo hesitated, looking from Caleb to the ridge. "Go," the wolf shot from their cover, a gray streak against the red rock. As expected, a rifle shot followed, kicking up dust behind Lobo's flying paws. In that split second of distraction, Caleb scrambled deeper into the canyon's embrace, sliding down a shale embankment and into a narrow twisting crevice that offered temporary shelter. Moments later, Lobo joined him, appearing silently at his side, his breathing heavy. They were safe for now. "You all right, boy?" Caleb rasped, running a trembling hand over the wolf's thick coat. Lobo was unhurt by the bullet, but as Caleb's hand moved down his flank, he felt a warm stickiness. He pulled his hand back. Blood. There was a shallow but clean gash along Lobo's hind leg, likely from a sharp rock in his desperate scramble. But as Caleb leaned closer to inspect the wound, he saw something else. Caught in the fur matted with blood were several strands of coarse dark wool. Caleb froze his fingers, hovering over the evidence. He stared at the black wool, then back at the empty canyon ridge where the hunter had been. A chilling, terrible thought began to form, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. Bartholomew Corbin was a cattleman. He didn't raise sheep. The canyon held its breath, the echo of the rifle shot fading into a silence that was somehow more menacing. Caleb worked quickly, his hand sure and steady despite the tremor in his soul. He plucked the dark, damning strands of wool from Lobo's fur and wrapped them carefully in a scrap of his kerchief. Evidence. It felt flimsy, a whisper against the scream of Cain's rifle, but it was a start. He cleaned Lobo's wound with water from his canteen, the wolf letting out only a low whine of pain, his trust absolute. They could not go back. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a baited trap. Silas Cain would be watching, waiting. They had to become what he already thought they were. Ghosts. They moved through the Badlands, a man and a wolf erased from the world. They traveled by the cold, impartial light of the stars and hid when the sun burned hot, melting into the shadows of the ancient, twisted junipers. Caleb's mind raced, turning the new piece of the puzzle over and over. Black wool. Corbin was a cattleman. Who in this valley raised sheep? The answer came to him like a half-forgotten ghost. An old man as much of an outcast as Caleb himself. Elias Vance. He kept a small hardy flock in the high rocky pastures to the north, a place of thin air and poorer grazing that the cattle barons like Corbin had no use for. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a few strands of wool. But it was the only trail they had. The journey took them 2 nights. They climbed higher, the landscape changing, the air growing thin and sharp. The world below, with its town and its fences, seemed a distant, feverish dream. Up here there was only the wind, the rock, and the silent, watchful company of the stars. Lobo was his shield, his ears and nose a constant, vigilant patrol, tasting the wind for any scent of the hunter that stalked them. They found the homestead at the first hint of dawn. It was nestled in a hollow between 3 stony peaks, a place that felt forgotten by time. And it was utterly, terribly silent. The small cabin was dark. The corral gate hung open on a single leather hinge, creaking a lonely rhythm in the wind. A profound sense of wrongness hung in the air, thick and cloying. Caleb dismounted his rifle in hand, Lobo moving low and silent at his side. They found the flock first. Scattered across the high pasture were the bodies of sheep, their dark wool stained darker with blood. They had been savage, torn apart with a frenzy that went beyond the clean kill of a predator. It was a massacre. A slaughter designed to look like a wolf's work, but it was too chaotic, too brutal. It was the work of a monster, but not a four-legged one. With a heart of lead, Caleb pushed open the cabin door. The inside was cold, the hearth long dead. An overturned chair, a shattered lantern. And on the rough-hewn floorboards lay the still form of an old man, his eyes open and staring at a ceiling he could no longer see. Elias Vance. A single dark hole in his chest told the story. This was not a wolf attack. This was murder. Caleb stood in the doorway, a witness to a quiet, lonely execution. He felt a kinship with the dead man, another soul crushed under the boot of a world that had no place for him. As a cold rage began to build in Caleb's gut, Lobo started to growl. Not at the body, not at the door. His attention was fixed on a set of loose floorboards near the cold fireplace. Caleb knelt, his fingers finding the edge of the board. He pried it up. Beneath it lay a small iron lockbox. Using the butt of his knife, he broke the simple lock and lifted the lid. Inside there was no gold, no silver, only paper. He pulled the documents out into the pale morning light. The first was a deed to this very land, all 300 rocky, worthless acres, in the name of Elias Vance. The second was an assayer's report detailing a rich and promising vein of silver found deep in the northern pasture. The last document made Caleb's blood freeze. It was a sales agreement transferring all mineral rights on the property from Elias Vance to Bartholomew Corbin. The price was insultingly low. And Vance's signature at the bottom was a shaky, spidery scrawl, the signature of an old man signing with a gun to his head. The whole ugly story was there, written in ink and blood. Corbin wanted the silver. Vance wouldn't sell, so Corbin manufactured a crisis. He hired Silas Kane to terrorize the old man's flock, to whip the valley into a wolf-hating frenzy, using Lobo as the perfect scapegoat. And under the cover of that chaos, Kane had come up here and finished the job. The posse Corbin was building wasn't to hunt a wolf. It was a victory parade, a public spectacle to legitimize his claim on a dead man's land. Caleb stood, the papers trembling in his hand. The wind howled through the broken cabin window, a mournful cry for the man who lay murdered on the floor. He was no longer just a man protecting his companion from a false accusation. He was the only person on earth who knew the truth. And out there in the vast wilderness, the killer was hunting him. He stood in the dead man's cabin, the silence a sacred thing. The papers in his hand were a testament, a final confession whispered from the grave. In that moment, Caleb Blackwood made a vow. Not to God, not to the law, but to the ghost of Elias Vance. He would not let this lie be buried with him. But justice was a rare commodity in these parts, and truth was a currency easily devalued. He couldn't ride into redemption, papers in hand. Corbin owned the town, the sheriff, the narrative. And Silas Kane owned the wilderness. He was caught between the bars of a cage, so he would not go to them. He would make them come to him. He laid Elias Vance's body to rest in his own bed, a final act of dignity. Then, with the deed, the assayer's report, and the forged agreement tucked securely inside his shirt, he and Lobo slipped back into the high country. They climbed to the highest peak overlooking the valley, a spire of rock that touched the clouds. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, Caleb built a small, deliberate fire. He added green pine boughs, sending a thick column of white smoke into the air. A signal, a summons, an invitation to a reckoning. He knew Kane would see it, and Kane would bring Corbin and his mob, expecting to find a cornered man, a trapped wolf. They would come for a final public slaughter. They would not be disappointed. Caleb did not wait for them at the peak. He led Lobo back down to Vance's homestead, but this time he prepared the stage. He took the old man's rocking chair and placed it on the small porch facing the trail. It looked out over the valley, a silent, lonely sentinel. Then he took the forged sales agreement from his shirt and carefully tucked it into the pocket of Vance's coat, the proof waiting patiently on the chest of the man it had killed. Then he and Lobo melted into the rocks above the cabin, becoming shadows, waiting for the curtain to rise. They came near dawn, a river of torches and angry men flowing up the mountain trail. At their head rode Corbin, his face righteous with false fury, and beside him the lean, wolfish shape of Silas Kane. They were confident, triumphant. The hunt was over. The posse spilled into the clearing surrounding the silent cabin. "He's in there!" Corbin roared, pointing. "The beast and the madman. We'll burn them out." "No need for that, Corbin." Caleb's voice cut through the morning air, calm and clear, echoing from the rocks above. He stepped into the light rifle held loosely, not aimed. "You came for a monster. You'll find him down there." The men looked from Caleb to the cabin, confusion rippling through them. Kane's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on his rifle. This was not how he had planned it. "What is this trickery, Blackwood?" Corbin demanded, his voice losing its confident edge. "It's the truth," Caleb said, his voice carrying to every man in the posse. "A story about greed. About a man who discovered silver on his land." He nodded toward the cabin. His name was Elias Vance. Corbin wanted his silver. Hired Kane here to manufacture a wolf panic to kill Vance's sheep to give him an excuse. A murmur of disbelief and doubt spread through the posse. "Lies," Corbin bellowed, his face turning purple. "Is it?" Caleb called out. "Then why is there a forged deed in his pocket? Go see for yourself. See the man you were really hunting for." Two of the ranchers, their faces grim, dismounted and walked cautiously to the cabin. They peered inside, then one turned his face pale. He's in there. He's been shot." The trap was sprung. The narrative was shattered. The posse was no longer a mob. It was a jury. Silas Kane knew the game was lost. He raised his rifle not at the posse, but at the one man who could testify. He aimed for Caleb's heart. He never fired the shot. A blur of gray fury, a silent explosion of muscle and teeth launched itself from the rocks. Lobo, in a single magnificent leap, slammed into the tracker, taking him down in a tangle of limbs and savage snarls. The wolf and the wolf hunter locked in their final primal battle. In the chaos, Corbin drew his pistol, his eyes wild with panic, and aimed at Caleb. But he had lost his army. The men of the posse simply stared, their torches illuminating a crime they wanted no part of. The crack of Caleb's rifle was the only sound. It was not a sound of rage. It was the sound of a debt being paid. Corbin crumpled from his saddle, a single neat hole in his chest, his stolen future spilling into the dust. The fight was over. Kane lay dead, his throat torn out by the beast he had so despised. Corbin lay still. The posse stood in stunned silence, the awful truth of their errand laid bare in the dawn light. Lobo, bleeding but alive, limped to Caleb's side, a guardian, not a monster. Weeks later, the valley was quiet. The law had come and gone, the testimony of the posse confirming Caleb's story. The silver from Vance's land was used to build a real town, one with a school, and a real doctor, its foundation built on a truth that had been bought with blood. Caleb stood on the high pasture, the wind clean and cold in his hair. Lobo sat beside him, his wound now a scar, his yellow eyes fixed on the distant peaks. Caleb knelt. "It's over, boy." He reached out and for the first and last time hugged the great wolf, burying his face in the thick wild fur. His shoulders shook with a grief that was not for what he had lost in the past, but for what he was losing now. "This isn't your world," he whispered, his voice thick. "Go on. Be what you were born to be. He gave the wolf one last push. Go. Lobo looked at him a long, profound, and heartbreaking stare. Then he turned. With a final backward glance, he loped away, a gray shadow moving toward the snow-capped peaks until he was gone. Caleb watched until his eyes ached. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust on his cheek. He was alone again. But the aching hollowness in his chest was gone, replaced by the bittersweet peace of a promise kept. He was no longer a ghost running from his past. He was Caleb Blackwood, and he was finally free.